Hi everyone, this is a video presentation about the potential for modding communities in cultural heritage. So one of the themes of this conference has been bringing it to the public, bringing cultural heritage to the public. And a lot of the research done in this area, my own included, deals with the issue of how can we better transmit cultural heritage through video games, particularly through serious games, but also what can we learn from commercial games, for example, from Skyrim. Clearly, we can all learn a lot from games like Skyrim when it comes to finding better ways to build virtual worlds, to add depth to our worlds, to better transmit culture. But there is a catch. The developers of Skyrim spent approximately $85 million developing the game. This is not the kind of budget that any academic is likely to be working with. So with that in mind, we need to look for ways that are cheaper, that are more cost effective. And this is why I have recently started looking more and more at modding communities and how through collaboration with modding communities, by learning from modding communities and by taking methods inspired by the modding communities, how we might be able to achieve more. However, to explain the value of modding, we need to first spend a moment talking about how cultural heritage in general can be approached through games. We have so far mentioned commercial games and serious games, and these are certainly the two main ways that cultural heritage is approached through games. But in another paper recently, I have argued that between these two main forms, there are also two hybrid methods, which are culture-centric games and game modding. Today's presentation doesn't give me enough time to explore all four of these methods in detail. And in any case, commercial and serious games should be fairly self-explanatory to this audience. There is, however, one thing that is worth adding regarding serious games, namely how difficult they often are to access. I am currently in the process of cataloging different RPG and RPG-like games published after the year 2000, which deal with cultural heritage in one of the four ways I have mentioned. And it is remarkable how few serious games there are amongst the 60-odd titles I have so far been able to identify. Not because titles such as this do not exist, but because they are often very difficult to locate. In many cases, really, the only thing you can do is read about a particular game in one or two academic papers, and it is not accessible in any other way beyond this. Which begs the question, of course, if a game cannot be accessed by the public, how can it possibly be effective at bringing cultural heritage to the public? Beyond commercial and serious games, the third model, which I call culture-centric games, requires a little bit more of our attention, as it's not a common concept. In fact, it is quite disputable. As far as I know, I am the only one making the case for a special consideration of culture-centric games as something separate from commercial or serious games. Even people who develop what I call culture-centric games are actually going to see themselves as either being commercial game developers or serious game developers. But I do find that this category is useful in many ways because separating certain commercial and serious games into this new category of culture-centric games helps to explain what exactly is going on at the intersection between commercial and serious games and how these two approaches sometimes converge. So on the one hand, we see scholars who argue that serious games they are not interesting enough to catch the attention of the public, and they can be improved by incorporating a gameplay model from commercial titles. One example of this approach is Ohana. Although this game is designed very much as a serious game in the sense that it is supposed to educate about native Hawaiian culture, it is designed to imitate World of Warcraft. World of Temasek, which we will discuss in depth shortly, is another example of this approach. So these games retain a serious game-like concern with detailed and accurate cultural information, but they want to present this in an enjoyable commercial game-like package with fun gameplay and mass appeal. Probably the most successful example of this approach is Never Alone, which I think needs no introduction here. But culture-centric games can also arise when a commercial game chooses to place stronger than usual emphasis on culture. And typically this is done actually to leverage cultural heritage as a selling point, so pure commercial concern. So for instance, the role-playing game Mount and Blade with Fire and Sword made a very conscious effort to depict itself as an adaptation of the classic Polish historical novel With Fire and Sword, written by the Nobel laureate Henryk Sienkiewicz. The game's depiction of its setting, the use of cultural heritage, I have found it to be ultimately rather limited, quite shallow. But nonetheless, it was this cultural setting that was notable about this title. It was used as a selling point to distinguish between this game and other games like it. Many other games all around the world take this approach, and arguably even the famous Assassin's Creed series has come very close to being a culture-centric game. The final approach, and the one that I want to spend the most time on in this presentation, is modding. Like culture-centric games, modding can in some ways be seen as a hybrid between commercial and serious games. The derivative relationship between game mods and commercial games is very clear. Mods are simply packages of additional materials designed to expand a particular commercial game. And modding itself, as a phenomenon, has garnered a lot of scholarly attention. But interestingly enough, mods themselves don't seem to attract very much attention. So it's almost as if the process itself is noteworthy for scholars, but the outcomes of the process are kind of seen as irrelevant, or at least that's the way it seems. But I think from a cultural heritage perspective, the results can be very relevant indeed. Modding very strongly interfaces with serious game concerns. So modders actually, they typically work on the mods that they make for their own gratification. They do this for fun. The practice of modding is really a form of entertainment in its own right. However, it is not at all unusual to find modders whose stated objective is specifically to improve the cultural detail or accuracy in a particular title. One example of this is Tsatadi's visual and historical mod for Mount and Blade with Fire and Sword. Players sometimes also engage in efforts to adapt a game into an entirely new setting, what is called a total conversion mod. And here again, the Mount and Blade series provides some very interesting examples, one being Britain-Walda and another being Suvarnabhumi Mahayuth. Sadly, these projects seem to remain entirely outside the interest of cultural heritage scholars. Now, maybe some of the European archaeologists present at this conference might be able to point me to a paper that analyzes the cultural accuracy or inaccuracy of 7th century Britain as shown in Britain-Walda. I, in any case, have not been able to find such a paper. Modding also requires a bit of explanation in terms of the process involved. So what does it actually mean that mods are produced by players? How many players does it take to produce a mod? How do these players get together for bigger projects in any case? In exploring this subject, the education scholar James Paul G. proposes the term passionate affinity space, or PAS for short, to describe how players collaborate. So players in a passionate affinity space converge around a strong common interest. That's the passionate affinity. The space itself can be real or online. So an online space can be a website or a forum. And it is a space rather than a community because its structure and membership is fluid and porous. So members will show up and then they will disappear. Leaders will arise and again they might disappear. And leadership itself, it's based on example and contribution. So a leader is somebody who is a useful resource for other people, not a hierarch. And the concept obviously is not exclusive to games. In a very real sense, a conference such as this one is a PAS, and another example of a PAS can be the Wikipedia, for instance. Player creativity within the PAS is nothing short of astounding, both in terms of its diversity and complexity. The second biggest English-speaking Wikipedia in the world at the moment, with more than 100,000 articles, is the World of Warcraft wiki. The Elder Scrolls equivalent is slightly smaller, it's only got 42,000 articles, but that's already much more than is included in all the strategy guides published by the developers. This is not merely a repository of raw knowledge either. Considerable analysis is involved, and sourcing is often as important as it is in the academia. Beyond data collection and analysis, players also engage in creativity and expression. They produce YouTube videos, often with costumes, fan fiction, fan art, and of course they produce mods. In the same way that the internet facilitates collaboration on knowledge repositories such as the Wikipedia, it also facilitates creative collaboration. And not just between players either, but also between players and academics or commercial game developers. A concept that John Banks has described as co-creation. Players also readily exploit modern collaborative platforms like GitHub, and they have their own online distribution networks, for example Nexus Mods and ModDB. The methodological aspect is very much worth highlighting here. Eric Champion mentions in his recent book that the academic serious game scene is highly fragmented. I have mentioned also that it's not uncommon for serious game projects to only be described in an academic paper and otherwise not ever be actually accessible. By extension, there is also little possibility of reaching out for collaboration on works like that. We have much to learn from game modding when it comes to methodology. I would like to invite you now to consider a particularly striking comparison of two games, both exploring the same cultural heritage, but one being a culture-centric game, a serious game that imitates a commercial practice, and the other being a mod. So the mod in this comparison is Suvarnabhumi Mahayuddh, which, as I mentioned before, converts Mount and Blade Warband into 16th century Southeast Asia. It was developed mainly by Thai players who enjoyed the original game but really wanted to see their own history and geography placed within that game. World of Temasek, in the meantime, is a culture-centric title which was developed through a collaboration between government, private enterprise, and academia. This collaboration had as its purpose the development of an MMO which could be used in Singapore schools as part of the national curriculum to teach Singaporean history, particularly the 14th century period. World of Temasek seems to have been part of a broader regional trend because there are two other similar government-backed MMOs in Southeast Asia developed around the same time. As we compare these games, there's no doubt at all that World of Temasek is the more highly polished of the two. Obviously, it was developed with careful pre-production and with high attention to historic detail. It is very important that the game was built from the ground up for this particular purpose, because it means that the game fairly smoothly integrates heritage and gameplay. And yet, Suvarnabhumi Mahayuddh still holds its own in this comparison. This mod, developed without any funding at all, has a far broader scope than Temasek does. The latter revolves only around the geographic and cultural area of Singapore, while Suvarnabhumi Mahayuddh encompasses the entirety of Southeast Asia. It includes Burmese, Thai, Chinese, Vietnamese, Cambodian, Laotian, and Malay cultures, as well as even the Portuguese who at this time held Malacca. The game's nature, the nature of Mount and Blade itself, that is, forces the mod to concentrate primarily on battles, and cultural depictions are for the most part limited to what you will see in battles, so military formations, the kind of weapons and armor and clothes that are used by military forces, the battlefields themselves, which also include cities and villages. The cities themselves, in many cases, are simply retextured versions of models from the original game. So, while they still capture some of the feel of Southeast Asia, they are certainly not culturally authentic in the way that Singapore and Temasek is. One final aspect of this comparison needs to be mentioned, which is that World of Temasek is dead. Subsequent changes to the educational curriculum basically rendered the game irrelevant, so that it is no longer employed in schools, and there is also no more funding for its continued development or technical support. The game is still available, but as far as can be determined, it is not being played by anyone. Suvarnabhumi Mahayuddh, meanwhile, lives on. The original founder of the mod has disappeared at some point, and the team now continuing development is essentially completely new. And it doesn't matter. They're still developing new features and enhancements and producing new versions of the mod. And while the mod's audience is probably fairly small, it is still incomparably more popular than Temasek. Now, I absolutely do not wish to disparage the developers of World of Temasek, but the results of this comparison are striking and they are not favorable to Temasek. Even more striking is the fact that this same comparison could be applied virtually word for word to both King Naresuan Online and Nusantura Online. It is time to bring this presentation to an end, and I would like to conclude with a series of questions. Supposing that I were one of the scholars who had collaborated on World of Temasek with the objective of creating a game with accurate cultural heritage, is there anything preventing me from also contributing my expertise to a mod like Suvarnabhumi Mahayuth? Could this also produce tangible results? Secondly, if I were able to obtain a research grant, could I use this research grant to finance deeper collaboration with a modding team? For example, to supply them with better graphical assets than retextured Scandinavian buildings posing as a Thai city. If I were a European scholar, for instance a British or a Dutch archaeologist, I would be looking very intently at Britenwalde and at Mountain Blade Viking Conquest, and I would again be asking myself similar questions. But in all of these cases, perhaps the best question to start with should be addressed to the creators of these mods. Are any of these creators already postgraduate archaeology or history students? And the answer, I strongly suspect, is affirmative. I suspect this firstly because I am one of these modders. But also, when I contacted Satadi, the author of the aforementioned mod which enhances with fire and sword, and I told him that in passing that I am a PhD student exploring cultural heritage, his response was, "Oh, another one." So it's clear that the scholars are out there modding away, but they're not talking enough about it. And this is unfortunate, and it is a conversation that I think would be good to get started. Now finally, for many projects, the serious game is still going to remain the best viable option rather than modding. In projects like this, it is still worth asking some questions regarding modding. Working on a serious game project, could I improve my work by harnessing mod-inspired methodologies, or simply by employing better cooperation in the way that mods employ great cooperation? Can co-creation, either co-creation with gamers or with other scholars or with game developers or with all of the above, could that allow us the means to achieve more than our budget will usually allow? Could there be a serious game equivalent to ModDB, allowing us to share and to collaborate more efficiently? I will leave you with these questions. Thank you.